Hi there, welcome to this MCQ blast for memory on paper 1. This is actually the second of the memory MCQ blast, so if you haven't checked out the first MCQ blast, also have a go at that one as well. In terms of how it's going to work, there's going to be 15 different questions. Pause the video after I've read through each question, give yourself a little bit of time just to think about what the answers, keep your score as you go along. Okay, let's get started. Question 1. Take a look at the box on the right hand side here, and I'd like you to select the coding type and researcher that are missing from the red box. So I'm looking for two different letters for this answer. Pause the video and take your time. All right, now the correct answer here that we're looking for is A and C. And what we have on this table is the real detail for the multi-store model of memory. And it clearly shows exactly what you need to be doing in respect to the three stores. That's to say the sensory register, short-term memory and long-term memory. Because what you need to be able to do is make reference to their capacity, duration and coding. What this table is also really useful for is in highlighting the differences between the different stores. For example, if I was asked about a difference between short-term memory and long-term memory, I could refer to the fact that the information is stored differently. That's to say there's a difference in the way that the information is coded. So semantically for long-term memory and acoustically for short-term memory. Okay, next question. What is this the definition of? Refers to the way in which information is changed and stored in memory. Is it A, duration, B, coding, C, capacity, or D, semantic? Pause your video. The correct answer we're looking for here is B. Now, this highlights another layer of knowledge that you may be asked to demonstrate about the multi-store model in respect to what the terms duration, capacity and coding mean, as well as the respective research that goes with each of these stores. So to define duration, we could state that this is the length of time the information is held in the memory store, and for capacity we could state the amount of information that can be held in a particular store. Okay, on to question 3, which is what is the most common experimental method used when investigating the multi-store model of memory? A, independent groups, B, repeated measures, C, field experiment, or D, laboratory experiment. Pause your video and think what the answer is. Right, the correct answer here is D. Just a couple of points with this question, because number one, it's just a really nice link to a common problem that we see in research methods topic where students get the term experimental design and experimental method mixed up. Now, design refers to the setup of the experiment, which is repeated measures, matched pairs, or independent measures. And method, the term experimental method refers to whether it was field, lab, natural or quasi. The second point just to note here is that the research used in memory tends to be, like we've said here, very much laboratory based. And as such, a common criticism of that research tends to be just a question mark really over the artificial nature of the tasks that participants are asked to carry out. Question 4. Which type of long-term memory is being described in this stem? Mary can make a cup of tea easily, so easily that she doesn't even have to think about how to do it. Okay, is it A, acoustic, B, semantic, C, procedural, or D, episodic? Pause the video. Okay, now the answer is C, procedural. Now there are three types of long-term memory named on the specification: procedural, semantic and episodic, and you may be expected to demonstrate knowledge of those, apply your knowledge like you've done here, or evaluate them. One way to demonstrate knowledge is just to draw out the implicit or explicit nature of the types of long-term memory. So something also referred to as declarative, which is expletive, or non-declarative, which is implicit. And we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in the next question. Okay, question 5. Which of these correctly explains the difference between semantic memory and procedural memory? So just take a moment there just to read through those two different answers. Pause your video. Right, now the correct answer that we're looking for here is A. So in the previous question, I used the terms implicit and explicit as a way to describe the types of long-term memory. And what this question demonstrates, if you're going to do this, then it's really important that you apply those terms accurately. Now, as you can see here, the response in B has them confused, as semantic memories are explicit and procedural memories are implicit. Now, if you are asked about the differences in the types of long-term memory, this just illustrates a couple of potential avenues, because we could compare them on the basis of whether or not they're explicit or implicit, and we could also look at the differences in respect to the parts of the brain that are said to be associated with each type of long-term memory, just like we've demonstrated here in answer A. Okay, question 6. I'd like you to take a look at the diagram just on your screen there, which is of the working model of memory. And I'd like you to select 2 terms from the list below to describe what is missing from that box there under phonological loop. So pause your video. Okay, now the correct answer here is A and D, and hopefully, it's quite a straightforward question. The purpose of this is just simply to demonstrate additional AO1 detail that you could include for the working model of memory. And this is perhaps the detail we'd expect to see from students gaining higher marks in these types of questions. This is because it's a pretty safe bet to say that most students understand the structure of working memory in respect to the central executive, episodic buffer, visuospatial sketchpad and phonological loop. But what some students are able to demonstrate is an understanding beyond that. That's to say, going into detail about the different parts of the visuospatial sketchpad and the different parts therefrom within the phonological loop. All right, question 7. Which was the last part of the working memory model to be added to the model? Is it A, episodic buffer, B, phonological loop, C, central executive, D, visuospatial sketchpad? Pause your video. Your answer there is A, and I guess the question is, well, why did he add it? Well, Badley said in 2000 that there were a number of phenomena that weren't able to be accounted for by the original model, and the purpose of the episodic buffer was that it has allowed us to see how in short-term memory we're able to integrate information rather than just isolating it into subsystems, and as such he argued that the addition of the episodic buffer provided a more comprehensive understanding of working memory. Question 8. Which of these is not a similarity of the multistore model and the working model of memory? A. There is case study support for both. B. Studies used to support both often lack ecological validity. C. They are both models of short-term memory. D. There is experimental research support for both. Pause the video. Right, the correct answer here is C, and the purpose of this question is to demonstrate an area of confusion with some students. They often compare the multistore model and the working model of memory and argue that one is better than the other without really being able to explain why. So arguably the working model of memory is a more comprehensive model, but the point that we must remember is that it only gives us an account of short-term memory, whereas the multistore model of memory was concerned with many more facets of memory, that's to say the sensory register, short-term memory and long-term memory. Okay, question 9. Which of the following is an example of proactive interference? All right, so just you pause the video now and take a moment just to read through all of these different examples. All right, the correct answer there is C, learning a new sport but mixing up the rules with sports you had learned previously. So A on the examples here is retrieval failure, and this is an example of what we call state-dependent forgetting. B is also retrieval failure, but this time it's the context cues or the lack of them that are responsible for the forgetting. C, like we've said, is an example of proactive interference, and D here is retroactive, with the new names interfering with the teacher's ability to remember the ones previously learned. Okay, question 10. Which of these statements about the effect of anxiety on eyewitness testimony is not correct? A. Anxiety can have both a positive and negative influence on the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. B, the weapon focus effect is an example of how anxiety affects the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. C, the Yerkes-Dodson law can be used to explain how anxiety influences the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. And D, anxiety can only negatively impact the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. So pause your video, have a think. Right, the correct answer there is D. Now, anxiety in eyewitness testimony, in terms of its effect, can be a difficult area for students to grasp. The reason being is that anxiety can have both a positive and a negative effect, which is illustrated by what's called the Yerkes-Dodson curve, which is on the slide there. Now, that demonstrates how the performance or the accuracy can actually increase when there's some arousal, that arousal being anxiety. But if there's too much anxiety, then it will begin to have a negative impact. Now, it may therefore be the case that in the presence of a weapon, this results in too much arousal for the individual, so their recollection of events is generally not very accurate. All right, question 11, quick one here. The term misleading information refers to A, leading questions, B, post-event discussion, C, leading questions and post-event discussion, or D, anxiety. Pause your video. Okay, the correct answer here is C, and we've put this one on just to highlight how important it is that you know the specification. If, for example, you had a 16-mark question on discuss the effect of misleading information on the accuracy of eyewitness testimony, stronger students would be able to pick out the fact that on the spec, misleading information is comprised of both leading questions and post-event discussion, not just leading questions. Question 12. Okay, what would the area indicated by the yellow star be labelled as? A, smashed, B, hit, C, control, or D, bumped? Take your time with this, pause the video. Now the correct answer is C. Now this here is the research that you've probably used to illustrate the effects of leading question on the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. Of course, it's the research by Loftus and Palmer. Now these results are those from the experiment where they were asked whether or not they saw any broken glass. And those who in the questioning of the event they'd included the word smashed were much more likely to respond yes to seeing broken glass than those in the hit condition and the control condition. The hit condition is the second, the middle one there that you can see on your graph, and you should be able to note that that's just slightly higher for the yes response than the control group. Question 13. Which factors are likely to influence the accuracy of eyewitness testimony in this scenario? When walking back from college, Mark was threatened by a man with a knife. A witness who saw the event rushed to Mark and quickly began discussing what had happened. So pause your video. Okay, your answer here is B and D, post-event discussion and anxiety. So post-event discussion is at the end of that scenario where it talks about the witness speaking to Mark and what they saw, and this discussion of course could have an impact in the accuracy of both of their recollection of events. Then for anxiety, which is D there, we can link to the fact that the person that had threatened him had a knife, and as we know that this can lead to an increase in the level of anxiety, which depending on how much it increases could negatively or maybe even positively impact his recollection of events. 14. Which statement below best describes how reversing the order can increase the accuracy of eyewitness testimony? So just take a moment just to read through those answers, make your selection, pause your video. Now, the answer here is D. This is a question on the cognitive interview, of course. And when describing the cognitive interview, it's good to try and see it as 3 layers of knowledge that you may be asked to demonstrate. The first is the naming of the 4 respective parts of the cognitive interview. The second is being able to construct example questions based on the different parts, perhaps as part of an application question. And the third layer of knowledge is demonstrating understanding of how the parts of the cognitive interview increase the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. So for example, like we've done here with the discussion of the impact of schema on our recollection of information. So it's not just about knowing what the parts of the cognitive interview are and what the questions look like, it's also how they increase the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. Final question here, 15. Which of these are valid evaluations of the cognitive interview? A, police forces use it in different ways. B, it's harder to carry out than a standard interview. C, it's more effective than a standard interview. D, it takes longer than a standard interview. So pause your video. Right, your answer is all of them. Nice one to finish off with, as all 4 of them are correct. So any of these statements, the point being that we could take them and develop them into a nice evaluation of the cognitive interview. Let's just take A here, for example. So within A, we can explore the fact that there's many inconsistencies in the way the cognitive interview is used, with different forces tending to pick and choose the parts of the cognitive interview that they like the most. Now, this is obviously an issue when it comes to considering comments about the reliability of the cognitive interview, which is obviously difficult to establish if different police forces are using different elements within the cognitive interview. Okay, so I hope you scored very highly on that MCQ blast, and if not, I hope you've taken something away from it. There's loads of study notes for memory on tutortube.net. There is also the additional memory MCQ blast that you could have a go at, and there's plenty of MCQ blasts for you available for the other topics from paper 1 and 2, and also the issues and debates from paper 3.